Hey everybody, it's EJ from eyedesyn.com, and today's tutorial I'm going to be sharing with you 7 ways that you can improve the way your 3D text looks inside of Cinema 4D or Cinema 4D Lite. Let's learn how. Alright, so let's go over some tips for making better looking 3D text inside of Cinema 4D. Now, a few things I want to lay out right at the beginning. Number one, we're going to be using Cinema 4D Lite, the version of Cinema 4D that actually comes with your Adobe Creative Cloud subscription. So if you have After Effects, you have Cinema 4D Lite. And I'm also going to be using this Motex Lite preset that is available to download for free on my website. I will add the link in the YouTube description, as well as a little linky right above the video here. So definitely download that if you have Cinema 4D Lite. If you have the full version of Cinema 4D, you can just use the built-in Motex. But this is a nice little preset that has all the functionality of the full version of Cinema 4D's Motex. So let's go ahead and let's just go over how to open up Cinema 4D Lite. I know a lot of people don't even realize that they have a free version of Cinema 4D included with their After Effects or Creative Cloud subscription. So the way to open up Cinema 4D, it's kind of convoluted. You got to open it from After Effects. So I'm going to go to File, New, Max on Cinema 4D File, and I'm just going to save this as an untitled. And then what that's going to do is launch Cinema 4D Lite. Now, when you download that Motex Lite, if you have Cinema 4D Lite and you want to download that from my website, what we're going to do is just go ahead and install this really easily. And to install the preset, the Motex Lite preset, we'll first go to Preferences. We'll go to Open Preferences folder. And then what that's going to do is bring up the Lite preference file here. And you want to stick that lib4d file that is included in that download and just put it in your library folder, and then in the library folder there's a browser folder, and just drag and drop that lib4d file in there, and then just close out Cinema 4D, relaunch it, or just do this before you even launch Cinema 4D Lite, and you can then access this. If you go to Window, Content Browser, boom, in your presets you'll now see the eyedesyn Motex Lite, and then all you have to do is simply double click to get our Motex Lite object. So here it is. Again, it has all the functionality of the Motex object in the full version of Cinema 4D, but it's laid out in a way that you don't have to build it using the fracture and extrude method that you typically would in Cinema 4D Lite. All right, so first things first with our 3D text is we're going to go to the actual text object here, and we are going to kern, ladies and gentlemen. For whatever reason, and I think it's due to the fact that kerning used to be so hard to do inside of Cinema 4D, but it's a lot easier now. Make sure you kern your 3D text, people. Don't lose your design license there. It's kind of the number one no-nos of designing is not kerning your text. So it's very easy. I just went to my kerning, show 3D GUI, and I'm just clicking and dragging here because you don't want that, and you definitely don't want that. So just give a little bit of love to each letter, and the design gods will thank you for kerning your 3D text. So now that you've kerned, now we can go on to the cool, interesting, sexy stuff like reflections and all that good stuff. What we're going to do is let's first create a material for our Motex. So I'm just going to double click in our material manager, double click on that material that we created, and let's just create a gold material. So let's go to our color channel and maybe get a little gold hue in there. Go to our reflectance channel, and this is where all of our specular and reflections are going to be. By default, we have a default specular, and I'm just going to remove that because all I want is a Beckman reflection. Now, this is kind of the most common reflection people will use as a starting point, so I'll just add that in there. And you'll see that we now have this fully reflective material. Let's just go ahead and apply this. I'm going to apply this to my extrude, and I'll explain why in a little bit later, but it gives us a little bit more control versus placing it on any other object. So let's go ahead and to create gold, a goldish reflection. We're going to go into the layer Fresnel. Now, Fresnel is basically that fall off, that reflection fall off or roll off that happens in real life. So Fresnel just tries to replicate that. And under Fresnel, we have two types. We have conductor and dielectric. Conductor is for like metals. And if you choose that and then go to the presets, you can actually see we have all of these nice metal presets. So we'll just go ahead and choose gold, and you'll see that it'll give us a nice goldish reflection, goldish hue in our reflection. And now we can go ahead and see what this looks like. Let's go and turn on interactive render region here, and I'm just going to increase the bounding box. And then this little triangle here, this little arrow, I'm going to bring this all the way to the top. This is actually our interactive render region quality. I'll just crank that to the max, turn it all the way up to 11. And you're going to see that we have a reflective material, but we're not really seeing any reflection, right? So that's because if you're in a vacuum with not like a Hoover vacuum, but in the vacuum of space, with nothing around you, you're not going to be able to reflect anything. Everything that has a reflection is reflecting everything around it. So those nice highlights, all those glints are due to the lights in your room, or just the objects in your scene. Since there's no other objects in the scene but the text itself, it's really not looking very interesting. So we can do two things. Number one is creating an area light. And I like using area lights because what area lights allow us to do, if I just move this over here, is we have this nice little bounding box here. And we can actually use this as like a light box by going into our light object details and going into show in render. And what that's going to do is actually show you what the area light actually is. It's a plane that's fully luminant. And you can see if I rotate this, but you can see that this actually isn't this white box. This plane is not actually not showing up on a reflection. That's because we got to do one more thing, and that is to actually turn on show and reflection on our object or on our light here. And if I just move this into place, you can see this little card is now showing up in our reflection on our text. So I actually want to turn off show and render so we don't actually render out a white card there. But that's one way to introduce some more stuff in your scene for your objects to reflect. The one major thing that you can add to your scene is an actual HDR environment. And basically what an HDR is, if I just bring a sky into my scene, what a sky is basically a giant sphere that is going to be like your sky and your ground and all that stuff. And it's going to give our text something else to reflect. So we want to actually apply material or an HDR image to this sky for our text to reflect. And if you downloaded and installed the eyedesyn Motex Lite into your presets here, you can actually double click on this text file and you'll see we have this HDRI that I made for my TextEdge Pro preset that you can actually download as well. I'll show that a little bit later, but we can then use that as a image that our text can reflect. So I'm just going to double click, create a new material, and then what I'm going to do is just load this into our luminance channel. So I'm just going to click and drag and just bring it onto this texture. That's going to load that up, and then all I'll have to do is go and apply this material to our sky. And let's actually just rename this HDRI. And you're actually not going to notice too much. Again, everything's not looking that great. We're getting a little bit of some reflection stuff going on as far as like shades and different shades of this gold, but everything's looking fairly flat still. Looking very like late 90s 3D or something like that. So what we need to do to really allow our text or our objects to reflect is by not making our text so dang flat. So all the reflective surfaces that you see have some kind of, like if you look at a can or something like that, or a bottle, it's because it's nice and smooth and curved, and that allows your object to pick up a lot more reflections. So to be able to add some rounding to our text, we simply have to go to the caps, and instead of just having sharp-edged caps, we're just going to go and choose fillet caps. And what that's going to do is round everything out. And you can already see that by adding that little rounding, we're getting a lot more curvature here. And, you know, even in real life, nothing has a perfectly sharp edge anyway. So you want to introduce a little bit of rounding here. You can see we're getting this really nice glint on the edge of this rounding here. And if I go into my options here, or in my display, we can go to Garage Shading Lines. And if I turn off my interactive render region, you can see what's happening. We have a step, which is basically the subdivisions of our cap, fillet cap. And then we have the radius, which is how big that rounding is. So if I increase this, you can see that our rounding got bigger. One thing I like to do is if we know we're only going to be looking at the front of our text, we actually don't need to have any geometry or subdivision on the back. So on the end, I can just change that to cap, and we can get rid of that useless geometry and subdivisions that we're not even going to see. So I'll just, you know, optimize your scene a little bit more by not having all those extra polygons back there. But what you're going to notice, if I go into just normal garage shading mode and go back into my interactive render region, boom, right there, you can see that we kind of have some weird stuff happening, especially right here on our M. We got these little shards happening, and this is due to the fact that with the MoText object, we have these weird subdivisions, and these can be more prominent depending on the font you're using. So it's just artifacting that's occurring here, and that affects our reflections. Now, I've seen a lot of 3D text with some really crazy chunky stuff happening like this, and there's one quick fix to prevent that. So to prevent that and to smooth everything out, we're going to just simply increase the step here. Now watch what happens when I change this to, say, 15. You're going to see that that smooths everything out. We're getting less of those jaggy little pieces there. Another thing that you can do to help prevent that is by clicking this Create Single Object. And what that's going to do is smooth out things ever so subtly. But what the Create Single Object does is basically fuses the cap to the extrude of the object and tries to smooth everything out that way. So that's just a really nice important thing to do there. So we can even maybe increase this a little bit more because we're still seeing, well, I just accidentally moved that to 1, but you can really see that pronounced all the jagginess there. Let's just change this to, say, 15, and you know, we still have some of the issues right here, so maybe let's do 30, and that smooths out everything really nicely. And you know, the O is definitely one of those objects that has a lot more subdivisions to get the round shape, and you can see that this reflection's nice and smooth there. All right, so we added some rounding to our text to pick up nice little glints, nice little highlights on the edges, on the rounding of our object. We also use Create Single Object to smooth out the whole entire extrude of our object, so the front cap and the actual extrude itself. And we used a light in a sky to add more things to our scene to pick up more reflection. So one way we can make this look a little bit more interesting is, you know, this pure shiny texture here looks kind of fake and just way too glossy and over the top. You know, you don't always need sexy, like super shiny text. What I like to do is just maybe introduce just a little bit of roughness here, and you can see that if we crank this all the way up, we're going to get a nice kind of diffuse, almost like specular highlight happening. And one thing that kind of blew my mind as I was working in 3D is that, you know, specular is actually fake reflection. It's just a faster way to calculate it, because really all the things you see in real life, it's all a reflection. There's no specular. Specular is created from very hot objects in your room, like a light that is creating that specular hit on your object, reflecting that light. So everything's a reflection, right? So we're just going to kind of roughen that up a little bit, maybe tone down the actual overall strength of this reflection layer. But you can see that introducing a little bit of that roughness gives it some grain, gives it some texture, and it looks really, really nice. So one other thing I like to do Let's actually first create another light. I'm just going to command click and drag, create another light and just move it maybe over here just to illuminate more of our text. Another thing I'm going to do is go ahead, select both of my lights, go to the fall off, and just choose the physically accurate inverse square method. And that'll just create a little bit more variation on how that light is cast on our object. So it's not just a constant, it's not just lit the same all the way across. It's always good to have some kind of fall off on your lights to have things look a little bit more realistic, a little bit more interesting. And then maybe even turn down the brightness on one of your lights as well. All right. So let's actually figure out some ways we can introduce a lot more reflection to our text. And one thing I like to do, and somewhere along the way my gold text turned to 3, so I'll just rename that gold. And one thing I like to do to have our text pick up even more of that reflection. Again, where the interesting stuff's happening on our text is where we have that rounding. We have the nice rounded edges is picking up some of those nice highlights. So one thing I like to do to try to fake and introduce a little bit more bumpiness to our text is by going to the bump channel, turning that on, and just loading up a noise texture. You can see that we're getting really bumpy like waves, and it's reflecting a lot more of our HDR image due to it not being flat as a board. But you can see this is way overkill. So what I like to do is maybe increase the global scale to something like 1200 or something like that. Maybe that's a little bit too big. Let's just try 800. And you can see that this is pretty subtle. You don't see it so pronounced. You can even see in like the preview, you see a little bit of like the bump kind of happening. So it adds a little bit of imperfection in that bump, really helps us kind of warp the front side of our text. And it's actually not actually warping it if you see straight on. And since it's in the bump channel, it's actually not distorting our geometry, but it is just adjusting and adding that bump to our material that picks up a lot more of these reflections. It looks a lot more interesting. Now let's just compare and contrast before and after the bump. So that's with the bump and then without the bump. You can see how much of a difference that makes. We get all these nice extra details by introducing that bump, and it could be even super subtle as well, or it can be very pronounced, maybe something like that. So that looks really nice. Maybe that's a little bit too much, so we can even tone down or maybe even blur our reflection even more. So we got these really nice hot spots and stuff like that happening, but it's more diffused out, so it's really not overpowering anywhere. Another way we can introduce a little bit more rounding of our surfaces on top of the bump channel is by introducing some deformers. So what I can do is go ahead and let's just maybe get like a bend deformer here. And I'm going to place it in the same level of hierarchy as our fracture object here. And let's just make sure this bend deformer is going to bend the right way. So let's actually just increase the strength. And I always never have my bend in the right direction. So I'm just going to rotate it again. And then to have this actually bend the other side, I'll change the mode from limited to unlimited. And you can see that that strength's a little bit too much there. And I'll just say keep y-axis length so it's not kind of stretching our text out. But if we just maybe use like a low value of say like 5, and let's go back into our interactive render region. And you can see that this adds a little bit more depth. You can even make out a lot more of that extrude, because as our text is like kind of face straight on to our camera, we really don't see that extrude, but having that little bit of bend allows us to see a little bit more of that. So a little before and after. So it's just subtle. Could be subtle or it could be very pronounced, maybe 15 or something like that. And I really encourage you to play around with a lot of these deformers. One deformer I really like to use is the bulge deformer. And what I'll do with this is you can adjust this and kind of have this bend or bulge or contract. And again, I'm going to make sure this is in the same level of hierarchy as my fracture object. And what I'm going to do is just rotate this 90 degrees and just make sure that the bounding box is unlimited. And you can see even just right there, it's a little bit much, but that kind of gives a nice cool text effect right there. Has this nice little dynamic bulge happening, or inner bulge, whatever you want to call that. Or have it like that a little bit. Maybe just a strength of 2, something like that. But one thing I really like to do is just moving this up or down. So one thing we can do is if we align the axis center to either the top or the bottom of our text, we can get this really cool thing happening. And especially if we use like a negative value, and if I position this to the top, we can kind of get like this Netflix type of 3D text happening. Again, just by aligning the top or the axis point of the bulge to either the top of our text or the bottom. So you can see I'm aligning it to the bottom of our actual text here. So that's really, really cool. So I'll just align this to the top here and have it kind of swing down like that. I can also duplicate this, maybe make this bulge forward, something like that. And you can see we have like kind of using a bulge for a bend. And again, we're getting a lot more interest happening there. And again, maybe even just a subtle amount there. Something like that. And again, if I align this forward, we get that bend, which is really nice. Maybe even move this up or down. All right, so we have some noise in our bump channel. We have some deformers here that's bending and creating a more curved surface for a lot more reflections to pick up. One thing I also like to do to add a little bit more contrast is by creating another material. And what I'm going to do is actually make this lighter and just apply this to the rounding or the edges of our text here. So what I'll do is I'll just double click on our gold material. Maybe just what I'll do is just maybe bring the roughness all the way down, crank up the reflection all the way, and then actually apply this to the rounding of our extrude object. And this is again why I applied all materials to the extrude object, is we actually have access to material selections on our extrude object. So C1 is actually just the front cap. So if I actually just go ahead and maybe just put an X in here so that deactivates our text, you can see that that gold material is just applied to the front cap. C1 or C2 is actually the back of our text here. So you can see the gold is now on the back and it's just constrained to the back cap. Or we can go ahead and use R1 or R2, and now I'll restrict that text to just the rounding here. And this actually looks pretty cool, just having some gold. I think it gives it that nice little contrast, especially with the white material. So maybe we'll stick with this. So what I'll do is let me just create a whole new material. Let's do that. Go to new material, double click, and just make this like a shiny white texture. Go and again, delete the diffuse, just get my Beckman there. Go to Fresnel, and for this one, we'll just use dielectric and go to plexiglass or PET, which is kind of like plastic. Has like a plastic roll off, and we'll just apply that to the main material there. So you now can see we have this nice white material. Maybe increase this so it's not so gray. Maybe something like that. All right, looking good. So now we have a nice highlight here, picking up on our edges. Now, even if we were using gold and gold, so gold on gold, what I like to do is to really let that highlight glint on the edges is just go ahead and maybe make this super, like almost white, and maybe go into our Fresnel, and instead of gold conductor, we'll use something like iron. So it's a little bit more whiter, and maybe really crank up the strength of that so it's really overpronounced. So we have this like nice white highlight with our gold material, and I think it just makes our text pop a little bit more and adds that nice little contrast there. But I think what I'm going to do is just keep the gold for the rounding and maybe use that white material there. And again, that material is kind of flat, so I can go ahead and introduce some noise and just make this big noise, maybe 900 for this. And you can see that little, just adding that little bit of bump gets a little bit more of this nice highlight stuff happening. Maybe that's a little bit too much. Make it 10% strength. All right. So one last thing I'm going to cover is we're adding contrast by using these different materials to really make either the edges kind of stand out. One thing we can do is add another bevel to our text. So what I'm going to do is create an instance or a copy of this text spline here. So I'll just go ahead and go to instance, and you'll see that this basically is referencing this original text object. I'm going to go ahead and place it in our MoText Lite hierarchy so it also gets deformed. Let me actually just hide the visibility of our sky in our viewport here by just changing and clicking on this little dot so it turns red. And then what I'm going to do is just move this, and you can see there's my MoText instance. And the nice thing about the MoText instance is that every change I make to this main MoText Lite object, so if I update this to text, this will actually update the instance as well. So that's just really nice. But what we can do is use this duplicated instance of our text spline and maybe sweep a circle around it. So what I'll do is get a sweep, get a circle object, and then I'll just have my circle underneath the sweep and then place my text instance under it. So we'll sweep the circle along the text instance, and we need it in this order. So whatever profile spline you want needs to come first in the sweep hierarchy. And this is way too big. So just move this down. Maybe something like that. And then we'll go ahead and move this text instance backwards. And you're going to notice we have these little pointy things here, right? And this is kind of due to font issues and how certain fonts are handled. Typically, to prevent something like this, I would just go ahead and just use a different font to see what other font doesn't have that issue. So if we go into our MoText, we can maybe go from Helvetica to maybe Helvetica New, and you'll see that just by changing the font, it really didn't change the font style too much, but it got rid of that little pointy kind of devil horn kind of thing that was going on. All right, so just doing that, fix that. We can now increase maybe the size of our circle. Maybe we can go ahead and maybe increase the scale in the Y to really make this nice and rounded. So something like that. And then what we can do is maybe add some gold onto that. So with that little instance there, we have this really nice rounded bevel that is now on our text and really adds this really nice dynamic look to our text. All right, so to recap, number one, Kern. Just do it. Kern 3D text. Don't lose your designer license. Number two, nothing in real life has perfectly sharp edges or totally smooth surfaces, so be sure to introduce a little bit more curvature and rounding to your object by using caps, by adding some noise to your diffuse or your bump channel to add a little bit more warping to your text. Also use deformers to then bend your text a little bit to have more of those reflections catch. And again, to create those reflections, we need to use lights. We can use the softbox little option in our lights as well. We can also use an HDR sky environment to have an image to be reflected into our scene. And again, we can fix the nice, those little funky Fong issues by making sure we go and we turn on the create single object and crank up the steps on our fillet caps. Also, we can add brighter materials or different materials to our rounding to make our nice little rounded fillet caps look a lot nicer. Our little bevels pop a little bit more. And then adding some nice rounded bevels or whatever kind of bevels using the text instance, circle, and sweep option. And if you make a lot of 3D text, definitely check out my plugin, Text Edge Pro. It pretty much automates all the stuff we did here, and definitely recommend that, especially for those of you who do 3D text a ton. So definitely check that out. Be sure to download MoText Lite on the website as well if you have Cinema 4D Lite. Now I want you to all go out there, make some cool 3D text, and hopefully this will make you really push the limits of how good your 3D text can be in the future. Alright, so I just shared with you a bunch of tips on how you can take your 3D text to the next level, whether you're using Cinema 4D Lite or the full version of Cinema 4D. Now, if you have any questions about anything I covered in this tutorial, whether it's downloading the free Motex Lite from my website or anything else that I covered, let me know in the comments section. I'll try to get to those questions as quick as I can. And if you like this tutorial, be sure to hit the like button. I'd really appreciate it. And I really appreciate all of you out there watching these tutorials. I'll see you all in the next one. All right, everybody. Bye.